Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to day 5. Today, we are going to be talking about how different data displays can be misleading. Okay, that word misleading, I want to talk about it and illustrate it really quickly. Okay, so maybe you or somebody you know, right? Maybe they've shared a story where maybe somebody was showing them some attention, right? They were maybe flirting, or maybe they were interacting with them in a way that led them to think that other person liked them. Okay, and then this person felt that, so they went to him and said, "Hey, do you like me?" And the person said, "No, I don't. I was just being nice. I was just being kind." All right, that is kind of a funny example of maybe a person being misled to think that maybe a person, because of their actions, maybe felt a different way than they actually did. Okay, and so this concept of misleading is really all about being made to think something that's not actually true. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at how different data displays can be misleading. All right, and so what I want you to do is you are going to have to put your thinking caps on a little bit, because in these types of problems, there are many different ways, many different contexts, many different examples that we can do. And so today, I'm really just going to give you one example. I'm going to talk through, actually 2 examples. I'm going to talk through some different things, and we're going to try to leave away with some big ideas that we can take away. All right, so let's look at this first example, okay? So in this first example, you have 2 graphs. All right, and it says graph 1 and graph 2, it shows that the stakeholders that are in favor of a school policy. So let's just say that this policy is who is in favor of school uniforms, right? How would you vote that? Would you like to have school uniforms? I bet you're probably shaking your head no, like you would not want to have school uniforms. But here's the data that shows this, and it shows school staff, it shows parents, and then it shows students, right? And so I want you to take a moment and look at both of those graphs, all right? Now, I want us to consider a couple questions, all right? So the first question that I want to ask you is, are these showing the same data, or are they showing different sets of data? Well, when you look at the graph, it appears that this graph is very different in terms of the bars, right? They look like this looks much higher, the school staff, than does the students. But when you begin to look a little closer, you do see that they are, in fact, showing the same exact data. So let's look at the school staff. This goes it goes a little bit above kind of the middle waypoint, so that's actually 76. For guardians, for parents, it's a little above, which is right 72 over here, which appears to be 72. So the answer to that first question is they actually are showing the same data. Okay, so it is the same data that is shown in these 2 graphs. Now, the second question says, but is it conveying the same message? In other words, when you look at these 2 graphs, do you come away thinking the same thing? Well, if I think about this, when I look at this first graph, I just kind of assume that whatever this policy is, and I said that it was like school uniforms, it looks like students are not in favor, right? Looking at this one, because it's so much lower than the school staff. And then the same thing, so it looks like it's further apart. There's a greater discrepancy or a greater difference between the school staff and the students. But then if I look at the other one, those differences don't look that different. It doesn't look that significant. In other words, these bars are really close together. They're very similar, okay? And so they do send a different message, all right? And so are they conveying the same message? I would say no, because the first graph, because graph 1 appears to show greater differences. And so again, when you look at it, it looks like it's much different. And that is the way that this first graph is somewhat misleading, right? Or it can be, right? It can be misleading. It just kind of depends on what the person is trying to communicate by the graph, all right? So let's look at question 2. It says, what do you notice that is different about the graphs? All right, what do you notice? So I want you to take a moment and look at the 2 graphs, and what do you notice about those graphs? The most important difference that you should notice is really the starting points for both of these graphs. So that's the first one. This starts at 68 and this starts at 0. And so the starting point is one of the major differences that is present in these 2 graphs. All right. Another difference that you might have pointed out or might have noticed is that this one counts by what? Graph 1 counts by ones, whereas graph 2, the intervals are about tens, okay? And so those are some of the differences, right? Graph 1 starts at 68, while graph 2 starts at 0. Also, right, the intervals are different, right? So graph 1 counts by ones, while graph 2 counts by tens. So again, those are some of the differences. All right. And then the last question I want us to consider is this. Which graph might the school use to represent the data in the city's local newspaper? And then which graph might the students use to represent the data in the school newspaper? And then explain. So I want you to pause. I want you to think about that. Which one might the school use in the local newspaper? And then which one might the students want to use? Right? And again, you can just think about it in the context that I gave you. Think about it in terms of school uniforms, right? Which one might the school want to use? Which one might the students want to use? All right, what I will say is this, you could probably have different answers than the one that I'm going to give you here. I've talked with some other teachers and we actually disagree on different things. And so this last question really is kind of subjective a little bit. But what I would say is that I think the school would want to use graph number 2, okay? And the reason I say that the school would want to use graph number 2 is that I think the school would want to show that, you know what, the school, the parents and the students, they all feel the same way. And that's kind of what this first graph shows. It shows that, hey, there's not major differences between everybody's opinion. While the students, on the other hand, right, they would probably use this graph to show, you know what, students feel this way about uniforms while school staff feels a different way. They would want to show that there's a difference between how the 2 groups feel, all right? And so that's what I'm going to write. So I'm going to say for the school would use graph 2 because they want to show that everybody thinks the same. In other words, I said that most are in favor, showing that there's less of a difference, okay? And then the students would use graph 1 because they want to show that there's a bigger difference. Okay. So there you go. So what I want us to understand is that sometimes, and this is kind of the main point of what I just shared, sometimes graphs are used to misrepresent information and promote a biased view. In other words, sometimes the graphs will show the data in such a way to make a point, to be misleading. Okay, so that's the big idea for today, is that we need to sort of analyze and to look at, okay, how might this graph be misleading, right? And so I'm going to give you some tips on how different ways graph can mislead people. All right, so here's some tips. One way that data can be misleading is to manipulate the scale, such as not starting the scale at 0 or using the scale that is not uniform. So that's exactly what was different here. This one didn't start at 0, and then the other one, this one counted by ones, this one counted by 10, showed a different scale. All right, manipulating intervals that could exaggerate the distance. Okay, so sometimes, you know, it might choose an interval or a range so that it appears to look either closer together or further apart than it actually does. All right, also it could omit, meaning it could leave out important information in the title or labels. Okay, so again, leaving out what the title or leaving out different labels that can mislead the data. Also, it can omit certain data points such as outliers or values that do not align with the desired outcomes. In other words, right, if leaving out information or parts of the data that doesn't make the point that the person graphing it or showing the data is trying to make. Those are ways that it could be misleading. Or then choosing a graphical display that does not best represent the data. Okay, and so that means just choosing the wrong type of graph to display the data. Right? So that is some ways that the data display can be misleading. It could cause you to think something that is not true. All right. And then to end this lesson, I want you to pause the video. I want you to read this example, and then I want you to choose A, B, C, or D to best describe what is the way that this information is being misled or misleading. Okay, so I want you to read the problem and then read the answer choices, and I want you to pick the best one. All right, Jasmine plays for the school soccer team, and she was one of the top scorers of the season. They played a total of 17 games. And Jasmine organized the number of goals she scored in a dot plot. Select the option. Okay. Hopefully you went ahead and answered this on your own, and I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is B. And the answer is B because this graph is misleading because it does not show all 17 games. If I count these dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, I end with 14 dots, but I played 14 games. So it's possible that Jasmine left out 3 games because maybe she didn't score, right, in those games. And so she wanted to show that she scored every game. So there are only 14 games are included. Okay. And then if you look at the other ones, right, this graph is misleading because there's no information on what the dots represent. That's not true because it shows that the dots represent the goals scored. Okay, so I know answer A was not correct. The graph is misleading because it is a very small interval of the number of goals scored. That's not really true because it just goes one, it is counting by ones up to 5, right? And if we know soccer, right, these this is accurate, right? You're not scoring a ton of goals in soccer. So that's based on what I know about soccer. And then the graph is misleading because the dot plot skews the results to make them appear better. No, I mean, the most dots are on one score, right? So there's more games where she scored one goal, and if she was going to skew the data, she would probably have it to where there were more games where she scored 4 or 5 goals. So that also is not necessarily the way that this data set is misleading. So hey friends, I know that that's a lot. Here's what I will say. You really have to, I told you in the beginning, you got to put your thinking caps on a little bit for this lesson. You got to think about it. What is what is being communicated? But what I will say is use those tips that I gave you because these are most of the ways that you're going to see the data be misleading. I hope this helps. Hey, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, ask questions, and thank you for your time and your effort.